May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts and minds be ever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Today's gospel is probably one of the most famous parables of Jesus. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. It gives us an example of love of neighbor that has been relatable since the beginning of Christianity. There are also bits of the story that give added depth to its teaching on love of neighbor. At first, this story has a very dark beginning. A man is robbed, stripped, beaten, and left to die at the side of the road. And if that's not dark enough, several people who should have taken care of him ignore him and leave him abandoned. I don't have to use much imagination to picture what this looks like in our own time, because I live downtown and our church is downtown, and I've seen people on the streets in various forms of trouble. Sometimes I've been able to offer help, and many times I haven't. Also, we see many images in the news and the media of people suffering in our wider world. There doesn't seem to be a shortage of the kind of suffering that's depicted in this story. But along with being a rather dark beginning to the story, the robbery itself actually demonstrates aspects of our common humanity. The description of the robbery is brief, but there are some key details. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him. There are a couple things here that recognize our common humanity. We're probably meant to assume that the man is an Israelite, given the audience, and that the next two characters who come along in the story are a priest and a Levite. But the man's identity is not mentioned or named. Furthermore, as the robbers have stripped the man of his clothing, they have also stripped him of cultural symbols of identity. Without clothes connecting him to any particular society, he is left stripped of part of his identity. But the Samaritan does identify something, a human being in need of care. The robbery has stripped away any distinctions of culture or society, but it has left the common human experience of suffering. Now, I could talk more about the Samaritan. There have been many sermons preached on how Samaritans and Israelites did not like each other, and how this is an example of overcoming prejudice and caring for one's neighbor despite our differences. But there's another character I want to talk about and focus a bit more attention on. The innkeeper contributes to this theme of looking beyond our prejudice. Some of us may have heard that Samaritans and Israelites didn't get along, but it was only recently that I learned more about the innkeeper. During the Second Temple period of Israel, there were two forms of inns or innkeepers. The first type of inn was hospitality that was offered freely by a community. There was an expectation that when a guest showed up in the community would look after them, free of charge, kind of like staying with family. The second type was a commercial inn. This was somebody who ran their inn as a business, kind of what we would think of when we think of our modern hotels and motels. Now, given the understanding of hospitality, these commercial inns were not well respected. It was thought that they were taking advantage of people by asking them for money in exchange for care. And these commercial inns were also looked down on as dens of vice, as people could frequent them for other uses. So the commercial innkeepers were looked down on as being lowlifes or scumbags. Actually, if any of you have seen the musical Les Miserables, then the innkeeper in that show is probably pretty close to how the audience of Jesus would have viewed the innkeepers, minus that catchy song, Master of the House. If Brad can, if not. That's good. Thanks, Brad. It's always funny when we can get a little improv in here. Anyhow, that's the type of character that this Samaritan leaves this injured man with. And at least that's the reputation he would have had. And yet, this disreputable character is expected to continue to care for the injured man. And for all intents and purposes, we have no reason to believe that he doesn't. So far, most of the lessons of this parable demonstrate a love that breaks cultural and social boundaries, a love that seems to defy limitations. But the addition of the innkeeper actually does put some boundaries and limitations in place. The Samaritan does not provide all the care for the injured man. He gets help. He delegates. He uses other resources that are available to him. This acknowledges that the Samaritan can't do everything, and it acknowledges that we have our own limits. There are the limits to what we can provide. The Samaritan understands that he has other responsibilities that he needs to attend to, much like Jesus understands that his time with his followers is limited. But despite his own limitations, the Samaritan finds a way to ensure that the injured man receives care. I can think of a variety of times when I've had to recognize my own limitations for caring for others. I'm a transitional deacon in the church. I'm not a doctor, so I can't cure illness or fix injuries. I'm not a social worker or a psychiatrist, so I can't solve problems of mental health or addiction. I'm not a police officer, firefighter, or paramedic. There are many emergencies that I am not equipped to handle. But I still come across such emergencies. Actually, this past Tuesday, I saw two separate incidences. The first was in the middle of the day where a man was having a seizure just downtown. Luckily, there was another person helping him. I went over and asked what I could do, and all I could do was go to the different stores and either look for medical attention or get a glass of cold water to help the person. The second event was that same evening. While walking home, I had to call emergency services for someone who was passed out on the sidewalk, and then keep an eye on the person till the police showed up. In both these cases, the assistance that I provided was limited. At least, I certainly felt very limited by what I could offer. And so did the person helping the man downtown. Afterwards, I talked with him, and he told me that all he was doing was just talking to the person very calmly and trying to tell them to keep breathing. And after helping the person, he just felt his own limitations. I felt grateful that we have emergency services to help with these situations, and I felt grateful for our neighbors who were able to stand up and provide assistance in these moments. So there's another insight that I recently learned. The last question that Jesus asks loses something in translation. Jesus asks, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? Instead of was a neighbor, a better translation might be, which of these three became a neighbor? This parable shows us that neighbor isn't just a state of being, or a state of being determined by geography. It's a way of behaving. We become neighbors by caring for one another. This story shows us that the care we need can come from people who we would never expect to show such kindness. And it calls us to do the same for others, while acknowledging that the care we can offer will fall within the bounds of our own limitations. I don't know what situations will wait for us beyond these doors, but I do believe that Jesus calls us to go and do likewise. Amen.